Hey everyone, Sky here with the build showcase of a fully minmaxed fake Temporalis Autobomber Bloodmage for the Path of Exile 2, Fate of the Vaal in the 0.4 League. So as you saw from the showcase, it's arguably the fastest Bloodmage build out there, and in my opinion, the best Bloodmage build for the entirety of the League mechanic Vaal Temple. From running a juice 77 plus room, scaled even up to 6 people, to speed efficiency and farming incursion crystals from maps. So this build draws inspiration from Raig's Bloodmage build and from Glitch's fastest build in the league, which is the adorned Temporalis Oracle Autobomber. The speed min-max of this build was done with Glitched, and with the two builds I added in my own theory crafting and inspiration to it, and that's what I'm going to explain in this video. There's a lot going on with this build that you may not have noticed from the showcase, so let's get in on it. Alright, first let's go over the fundamentals of the build. Witch's Bloodmage Ascendancy is popular because it can gain leech life from spell damage through Vitality Siphon, but in doing so, you also gain base life cost equal to your base mana cost through Sangomancy, meaning you still have mana cost. Now, to not need to expend mana, there are 3 ways to convert skill costs fully into life. Through the Blood Magic Keystone, which also removes your mana, through obtaining 100% or more spell or skill mana cost conversion to life cost, and the last way is through using support gems such as Life Tap and Adlui's Bloodletting, which converts all of your mana costs into life costs. Each has their own pros and cons, but for this build, we focused on the 100% mana cost conversion to life cost. Now, the two most popular forms of defense in 0.4 is Energy Shield and mana versus via Mind Over Matter. If you go the Energy Shield route, you also go Blood Magic to remove your mana, and in doing so, you would focus on items and the passive tree to boost up your Energy Shield as high as you can. In doing so, you also open yourself up to the Mysticism Spirit Support Gem that increases your spell damage or at max ES. Even though this costs Spirit, it's free to use if you put it into a Purity skill that's provided from a Scepter. Or if you go this route, then you also need some form of Energy Shield Sustain to keep your effective HP high, meaning you'll be able to regenerate your Energy Shield as you're taking chip damage while you're doing content in the game. So you'd be recommended to run something like a Cultivated Soul Tether that has the ES % loss per second modifier replaced, or the Essentia Sangui's Gloves. You run either of these with the fast metabolism notable, so you'll be constantly regenerating Energy Shield even when you're at max health. Now, if you go the mana route for defense, which I argue is much better both offensively and defensively, since you can mana stack even without a Cultivated Wrathpith via the Archmage buff and the Arcane Intensity notable, which is all the way up here. And then it will also allow you to use the Zenith 2 support gem, which is a 30% more multiplier, which is much higher than an increased spell damage that you get from Mysticism. And then for defensive side, you get a feeling that's similar to the 0.1 League's Grim Feast with the Mana Remnants for mana. When you run Mana Remnants, you get the mana sustain, but also the overcap, meaning you can get mana to go over 1.5 times your current mana or your maximum mana. So the mana route is what this build runs, and we'll go into the gear next. Alright, now with the fundamentals explained, now explaining gear choices is important on how I achieve the synergy for this build. So since I went the mana route, I needed to either use the Life Tap support gems and Adlui's Bloodletting all my skills, or obtain 100% skill mana cost conversion to life cost. Popular non-Bloodmage builds in this league use the Covenant Altar Robes to obtain Spell Leech and Life Remnants portion of the Bloodmage Ascendancy. But most of those builds almost always use Life Tap support gems to get the full life conversion cost. But for Blood Mages, and specifically for this build, support gem slots are extremely valuable since I use an Invocation Spellslinger and 2 meta skills Cast on Crit and Cast on Elemental Elements. This means that I needed to hit the 100% conversion. Now, the popular way to do so this league was to use the new league body armor at Ziri's Splendor, which as you can see, has a modifier where corrupted skills have 50% of their mana cost converted to life cost. The other 50% could be obtained from the passive tree via the Blood Transfusion cluster over here, which you add these 3 together is equal to 48%. With the armor, that's 98%, so you get the last 2% from a Heart of the Wild Diamond. So this has a conversion suffix modifier that can roll between 2 to 3%, but up to 4% with a Krangle Divine Corruption like this one. Unfortunately, if I did go down this route, I wouldn't be able to use the Temporalis for lowering Blink's cooldown, as you can see here. This is where Cultivated Gloves come into picture. So these Demon Sigil gloves, at its base, are energy shield ones, so it has everything that benefits a blood mage. A local energy shield that converts to mana with Eldritch Battery. It has max life for a higher health and resource pool, and has cast speed. The sacrifice 10% life, or this percent life, it can roll 5 to 15% to gain that much energy shield when you cast a spell. This is a deadline to us, which is great because that's exactly what we need to roll off whenever you cultivate it. So one of the cultivated modifiers is the conversion that we need, which rolls up to 50%. So you can see the one I have equipped has 48%. This is perfect because it does exactly what Azeri Splendor does, but only in the glove slot. So the ones I have also have the increased cost efficiency cultivated line, which is amazing because it keeps all my life costs down of all my skills, since Bloodmage has double the cost of basically any other spellcaster. This allows us to constantly cast all of our invocation and meta skills triggers repeatedly, and as you can see, 3 sockets here is icing on the cake. It allows me to run the 30% increased magnitude of non-damaging elements socketable, which increases our shock magnitude. Otherwise, cost efficiency and cast speed socketables are mandatory. So as you see, these gloves have 48%, and the blood transfusion cluster gives another 48%, which is 96%, and that's why I have to use Overworld Heart of the Well to hit the 100% conversion. So now the rest of the gear is pretty standard for you cast on crit Bloodmage, but with more emphasis on cast and skill speed. So an Overworld Temporalis is needed here for lowering the base cooldown of Blink to as low as possible. For this build in particular, I also needed a total of 440 Spirit to min-max the bare minimum needed with all of the skill techs that I've done. This is accomplished through a double corrupted scepter, which as you see here, this is giving me 248 Spirit, a corruption enchantment spirit on my helmet, and a solar amulet with the max T1 spirit roll prefix. So as you can also see, my Shrine Scepter gives me Purity of Lightning, meaning the rest of my gear needs to balance fire and cold resistance to hit resistance cap. So the +4 is another cultivation modifier here. The +4 skills on my helmet is also needed to hit the level 38 Blink, along with as high level of Comet and Arc as possible, which is 39 and 36 respectively, to get as much damage as possible, since there's no competition on how best to scale a damage for skills. So the wand needed to be 30% quality, along with granting level 20 Spellslinger to not only gain the extra socket for a 5-socket invocation, but also to be able to gain more energy. The 5 sockets is important for how the fake Autobomber part of the build works, which I'll explain a little bit later in this video. But having high quality and a higher level Spellslinger allows us to gain a lot more energy, which improves the flow of the build, making it feel a lot smoother. In the boots, mana socketables in the boots give more mana than Iron Runes through the Eldritch Battery conversion. And since this is a temple focused build, a Headhunter was a no-brainer. This one double corrupted with fire and cold resistance, as I mentioned earlier. So on both rings, there's a large emphasis on cast and skill speed. This, along with the passive tree and its jewel, is how I achieved right here over 6 blinks per second on in hideout on a Bloodmage, which this definitely pales in comparison to Glitch's 10+ that he achieved on an Oracle Druid, but this, in my opinion, is insanely fast for a Bloodmage. Amulet, as you can see, is anointed with fast metabolism, which is needed for that extra 1 second buffer on how leech works, which allows us to cast insane amount of comments and arcs, as you saw in the showcase, despite not looking like we had the life pool, as you can see, 2075 to cast these, since as you can see here, comment costs 1.3k life, snap costs 256, and arc costs 719. So with this gear kind of explained, let's go into the skills on how all of this synergy works. So the fake Autobomber portion is essentially moving the popular Doger's Undoing's elemental weakness from cast on critical or elemental elements in this league to Spellslinger. So since Blink is a spell that generates energy for Spellslinger, as you can see here, it's 10%, And if I blink once, now it's 17% and I have a charge of Spellslinger. So since blink generates energy for Spellslinger, and since spells socketed into Spellslinger have no casting animation or delay, you can simultaneously blink and cast Spellslinger Elemental Weakness at the same time while you're moving around. So as you can see here, I'm holding down Spellslinger and blinking around, and I'm casting both at basically the same time. And that's how it works. So in our Spellslinger, we have the usual Elemental Weakness with Dodra's Undoing, Efficiency 2, and Spell Cascade. Last slot being Boundless Energy, as mentioned earlier, to increase the amount of energy we gain, to allow it to feel more seamless and smooth while we're blinking around. Now, also my skills, may have noticed I'm using 3 Diala's Desire, 3 Uhtred's Auguries, and 3 Uhtred's Omens, despite them being grayed out. So this is a bug that would most likely be fixed in 0.5, but whenever you equip the Solus Ipsis helmet, which allows you to equip 2 additional of the same lineage gems in your skills, and you do so when you re-equip another helmet. So in this, basically I just put this on, equip those gems, put it back on my Vertex. You'll notice that the extra lineage support gems are grayed out, but what I noticed was that specifically for the Uhtred's and Diala's Desire lineage gems, the plus skill levels still apply for the Uhtred's, and for the Diala's Desire, the plus skill level and 10% skill quality applies. But the 10% Spirit Reservation Efficiency Multiplier is only applied to the first skill it's equipped to in your skill list, which is indicated by the only one where the skill gem is, or the support gem is lit up. So you can see here that my Cast Elemental Elements has a Spirit Reservation of 90, which maths out with Diala's Efficiency, which is a 90% multiplier. So 100 times 90% is equal to 90, which is multiplied after the other Spirit Cost Efficiency, which is additive to a divider. So since Cast Elemental Elements has no other Spirit Cost Efficiency, it comes out to 90 Spirit Reservation. While you look at Archmage, it's right now it says 85, but it gains Spirit Cost Efficiency from quality, which you can see here is 18%, which coincides with the bug where I'm still getting the +1 skill level from the Diala's Desire, but also the 10% quality. The math for the Spirit Cost Efficiency here will be a 100 base Spirit Cost divided by 1 plus the sum of all the Spirit Cost Efficiency, which for Archmage is 18%. So the formula becomes 100 divided by 1.18, which comes out to 84.74, which rounds up to 85. Now, if I swap these two in order, you'll now notice that Archmage becomes 76 Spirit Reserve, because you basically take the previous 84.74 math that we got from the previous efficiency and times it by 0.9 with the 90% Spirit Cost Efficiency of Diala's Desire, which is 76.27, which rounds down to 76. And now if you look at Cast Elemental Elements, the Spirit Cost Reservation is back to 100 despite having Diala's Desire on, which proves that the 90% reservation multiplier did not get applied. But as you can see, the one mentioned earlier, you still get the +1 and the 10% quality, as you see here. And same goes for Uhtred's, as you can see down here for my Blink, it's level 38, and despite being grayed out, Uhtred's Augury is still providing +3 levels. Now, Blink is an important skill to hit thresholds on. So if you look at the PoE DB, you'll see that the cooldown time for Blink starts from 4.5 seconds right here at level 1, goes all the way up to or down to minus 3.5 seconds or 3.5 second cooldown at level 20. This means that every 2 levels you're gaining 0.1 or you're losing 0.1 seconds off the base cooldown. So at level 40 it becomes a 2.5 second cooldown at its base. Now this is important due to how high a corrupted Temporalis can overroll on its minus cooldown modifier. So as you can see here, mine's overrolled to minus 2.35 seconds, meaning that with my level 38 Blink, it is a 2.6 second cooldown base. So that the Temporalis modifier subtracts from that first before any increased cooldown recovery rate is calculated. So if you look at my blink, which has, as you saw earlier, a 0.1 second cooldown, that's because its cooldown before any calculation is done is 2.6 seconds minus 2.35 for my Temporalis, which goes down to a cooldown of 0.25 seconds. So if you take that and divide it by 1 plus all of your increased cooldown recovery rate modifiers, then that's how you would get your end base cooldown. So Adziri's Impatient Support Gem gives 100%. The skill itself has 27% quality, 23% from the gem itself, and 4% from the socketables in my Temporalis, which equates to 13% cooldown recovery efficiency, 10% from my Heart of the Well, which you can see here, and from my Kima buff is additional 12%. So this is 0.25 seconds divided by 1 plus 1 from Adziri's Impatience, plus 0.13 from the quality of Blink, plus 0.1 from my Heart of the Well, plus 0.12 from my Kima buff, which comes out to 2.35. So 0.25 divided by 2.35 is 0.106, which looks like it rounds down to the 0.1 seconds that you saw. Now with that out of the way, the large majority of skills that we use are all Spirit Gems. First that we use is Cast on Elements, which you have Arc socketed in. Cast on Crit with the usual Comet, which is our main source of focus damage. We have Archmage, which is a huge gains damage as extra lightning with our mana stacking. We have Mana Remnants for mana sustain and overcap for higher EHP and survivability. We have Blink for moving around insanely fast with our Overworld Temporalis. And the last three other Spirit Gems that synergize with each other are Combat Frenzy, Siphon Elements, and Charge Regulation. I'll explain how that synergy works in the next section. Now getting back on the topic of Blink, there's been a large focus on Temporalis builds to get its cooldown to as low as possible. But most don't realize that the bottleneck is actually cast speed. So it doesn't matter how low your cooldown is if your cast speed is significantly slower than your Blink's cooldown. In an ideal world, you want both cast speed and cooldown to be the same, which Glitch has accomplished in his Oracle Druid. If you haven't seen his video, I highly recommend it, but unfortunately that's not feasible with on a Bloodmage due to how Oracle can gain time loss benefits much more easily per jewel socket than Bloodmage. Now going back onto the fake Autobomber with Dodra's elemental weakness, this is only possible because of how Dodra's damage is treated in this game. So you know that GGG's vision doesn't include infinite loops or self-triggers. They tend to nerf those to the ground, which is evidence of how they change heralds and meta skill generation, energy generation in 0.2 to 0.3. They remove the interaction where damage from a herald can proc another herald, which damage from herald procs the first herald, causing a loop and everything is dead on the screen. And they remove the interaction where spells cast from triggered meta skills were able to generate energy for itself and other meta skills. They also fixed Choir of the Storm's Lightning Bolt crit from triggering itself, which was popular in the 0.1 Temporalis Autobomber built by Jungrom, which this build mimics to a good degree. Well, Dodra's AoE that gets created is the same size as your curses, but it's implemented as a hazard. Hazards are things like traps, caltrops, spear-filled spikes, etc. Things that enemies can step onto and get damaged. They're still coded to generate energy for meta or invocation skills, so while Spellslinger is casting Elemental Weakness, the Dodra's hazard that gets created doesn't come from Spellslinger. It's a hazard that gets attached to the Elemental Weakness, which is separate from the Spellslinger. As a result, the hazard can generate energy not only for itself, Spellslinger, but also for cast on crit, if it crits, on cast on Elemental Elements, if it causes any Elemental Elements, which it is, with Shock and Ignite via the gains as extra damage on the Wand and Archmage. With Embitter, you can even get Freeze if your Dodra's hazard did enough damage, so while blinking around and spell-slinging elemental weaknesses, Dodra's is generating energy for Spellslinger, Cast on Crit, and Cast on Elemental Elements all at once, creating Scream Vomit and killing everything as you saw in this showcase. And with all of these skills explained, let's move on to the passive tree and jewels. Now coming from the previous section, the synergy between Charge Regulation, Siphon Elements, and Combat Frenzy is completed with the passive tree. Now first, let's talk about Elemental Infusions. These are kind of like charges, Power, Frenzy, Endurance, but there are more for certain spells and are more offensive. There are Fire, Cold, and Lightning Infusions, and this build uses all three of them. So there are several ways to generate these infusions. For example, the Living Bomb spell for fire, Lightning Warp spell for lightning, and Frost Bomb spell for cold. But there are two ways to generate all of them from one source: the Snap spell and the Siphon Element Spirit Gem. So Snap is a great skill that synergizes extremely well with this build for two reasons. It can generate all three types of elemental infusions, and because it does so by consuming the corresponding elemental element from the enemy targets, Shock for lightning, Ignite for fire, and Freeze for cold, it allows me to reapply them a second later, which builds huge amounts of energy for cast on elemental elements, and synergizes extremely well with Siphon elements, which I'll explain in a minute. Unfortunately, as you can see here, Snap does have a 4-second cooldown, but if you sock it into a trigger skill like Cast on Critical, that cooldown is completely ignored. I put this as low level as possible in my Cast on Crit, as you can see, a level 5 with the -1 corruption, to keep life cost of this as minimal as possible, since we're not using Snap for damage, but more for its utility. And as a result, it's generating me a plethora of mainly fire and lightning infusions. Enemies usually die before they can get frozen, so cold infusions weren't really generated this way because they needed to consume the freeze off enemy to do so. And if enemies are dying either before they get frozen or as they get frozen, element is actually never consumed. So that's where Siphon Elements comes into play. And it's also how it completes not only the loop on infinite fire and lightning infusions, but also cold infusions. So every time we ignite, shock, or freeze an enemy, there's a 7% chance with this current level to generate the corresponding infusion. So since Snap is consuming them and we're reapplying them with Dojo's elemental weakness, infusions are getting generated at insane rates from both sources. Now, let's talk about the spells that actually use these infusions. Arc and Cast on Elemental Elements uses lightning infusions to not only chain more, but also gain a massive 200% more damage multiplier, which is a final damage multiplier that scales its damage a lot more than increased damage sources. So Comet and Cast on Crit uses the fire infusions to gain both a much larger area of effect and more than double its damage. Spark, which we can cast on its own, uses cold infusions to generate more projectiles that come out of you in a circle and deal a lot more damage, allowing you to do more with your triggers. So the insane fire and lightning infusion generation that comes from the overlap between Cast on Crit Snap and Siphon Elements is perfect because with how many arcs and commons that get triggered, fire and lightning infusion get consumed at a high rate. And cold infusions you can consume at any time with manually casting Spark. So now your next question may be, how does all of this synergize together with Charge Regulation and Combat Frenzy? It does so with this notable Fusion of Power. So anytime I consume an elemental infusion, which is infinitely during combat, I gain a power charge. This means that I have permanent uptime on power charges because I'm consuming all of the elemental elements, which grants me, with Charge Regulation, a 29% more critical hit chance multiplier for all of my spells. Because of this, it allows me to forego a lot of critical hit chance on my gear and my tree, which is why my Spark only has a 62.7% chance to crit in Hideout and around 83 to 85% in combat, which goes upwards towards 100% with Headhunter buffs. So for Frenzy charges, that's done via Combat Frenzy, but you might be wondering how I'm CCing enemies, because to generate a Frenzy charge with Combat Frenzy, you need to either stun, pin, or freeze an enemy. So this is done via Cast on Elemental Elements Arc. So I have the Embittered support gems socketed in it, which converts all gains as extra damage into cold for Arc. This means that the huge amounts of extra damage that I'm gaining from Archmage, along with the gains from my wand and its socketable, are now all cold for Arc. This means that Arc is doing more than double its damage as cold, which when scaled with lightning infusions freezes and kills enemies constantly, which triggers not only the frenzy charge generation from Combat Frenzy, but also the chance to generate a cold infusion from Siphon Elements. This means now we have 100% uptime on power and frenzy charges and all three elemental infusions. So with charge regulation, frenzy charge is giving us a 27% increased skill speed, meaning we're blinking even faster or casting Spark even faster, and in turn we're also increasing the speed of our Spark projectiles. So the last charge is endurance charges, but they only grant defense or more defense multiplier, which is useless for this build because this build does not utilize energy shield, evasion, nor armor. So that's why we do not use endurance charges at all. So this leads us into the passive skill tree, which has been min-maxed for both damage and casting skill speed. So for example, we're using a Mental Electric cluster, Erasmus cluster, Overzealous cluster, and the acceleration cluster for cast and skill speed. And as mentioned earlier, since we're not using defense as much, the Cook cluster gives us insane critical damage bonus values with basically no downside. Now, you may have noticed that I'm not using the windscreen boots, nor am I using the impending doom cluster for faster curse activation, because that is required to make Dodra's elemental weakness work. Because in order for the hazard from Dodra's to be created, the curse needs to be set, which has a delay, which is the same across all curses, but that can be reduced by getting faster curse activation of up to 99%. Hitting 100% or exceeding it has a bug where the curse isn't even cast. So that's why you want to reach up to 99% but never exceeding it. I'm accomplishing this faster curse activation via a 64% rare Doran jewel. This gives me 64% increased effect of corrupted rare jewels in my passive tree, and I'm using normal sapphires that have a 15% faster curse activation. I'm utilizing 4 of these, and when I hover over here, you'll see that with the rare adorn applied, I get 24% faster curse activation. With 4 of these, it allows me to hit 96% faster curse activation, which is more than enough to set the curse and have Dodra's hazard set and do damage before it's cast again, which is cast insanely fast with my cast speed and with the no casting animation of Spellslinger. Now, for all my corrupted sapphires, you'll notice that they're all 5 modifiers, which gains the most benefit with the rare adorned. And also normally you will go with increased AoE of curses on them to increase the size of your elemental weakness curse, but I opted to put most of that responsibility on my time lost sapphire, and then instead get more elemental or spell damage on some of my normal sapphires like this one. Now, I cannot emphasize enough on how powerful a rare Doran time lost sapphire is in this cluster down here. So, for example, this is a perfect 5 mod one. So it has 7% critical hit chance, 2% increased cast speed, 3% increased area of effect, 6% increased AoE of curses, and 10% increased critical damage bonus. Now with the 64% rare adorn applied, each notable within this radius will gain 11% increased critical hit chance, 3% cast speed, 4% AoE, 9% AoE of curses, and 16% critical damage bonus. So I have 8 notables in range, with 7 of them actually synergizing really well with this build. So that means that an overwhelming majority of the cluster benefits the build tremendously. So the Stupefy and the Dizzying Hits cluster is giving us a total of 45% increased damage against dazed enemies, 37% increased critical hit chance against dazed enemies, and 25% chance to daze enemies on hit, which guarantees permanent uptime since we're hitting enemies extremely often with everything that's happening in the build. The Fable Stack cluster is actually, I found out, really important for this build because it makes it feel a lot more comfortable in sustaining the buffs for charge regulation for 100% uptime. Because it makes it so our power and frenzy charges, instead of having a 15-second base or default time, it goes up to lasting for 29 seconds. And this makes it so it's a lot easier to sustain the charge regulation uptime. The Howling Primate cluster is giving us 20 intelligence, and also which is giving us more mana for min-maxing our EHP and damage, but also it's giving us Aura of Magnitude, which is increasing how much lightning resistance our Purity of Lightning is granting us, allowing us to gear more effectively. The Chakra of Life is giving us 3% life, which is great for increasing our resource pool. And the Heart-Stopping and Heartbreaking cluster, that's popular amongst all builds. It's pretty self-explanatory with its crit damage, crit chance, strength, and end. Strike Through is the only notable that doesn't do anything for this build, but gaining all of those Adorn boosted Time Loss Sapphire modifiers is worth the 2 passive points to get there. So just from this Time Loss alone, with these 8 notables, I'm gaining 88% increased critical hit chance, 24% increased cast speed, 32% increased AoE, 72% increased AoE of curses, and 128% increased critical damage bonus. That is insane value for just one jewel socket. Alright, and that brings us to the closing remarks of this video. So first off, thank you all so much if you listened this far to all of my explanations on this build. The amount of synergy between every aspect of the build is really fun to theorycraft, build, and execute. And with the closing remarks, I wanted to go over the main pros and cons, in my opinion, of what the build are. So with the pros, the first one is that this build is extremely fast. You can get over 6 casts per second blink in hideout and upwards of 9 to 10 in combat with buffs. Of course, this pales in comparison with the glitches 10 in hideout with his Oracle Druid, but as a Bloodmage, I think this is still very impressive. The next pro is that it has very high clear damage that can complete almost any content in the game, and this includes not needing to do any kind of gear swap, skill swap, or jewel swap. Like once you have everything built, you can just go in and do any content. Next pro is that it has enough damage to carry a fully juiced 77 plus room temple scaled to 6-man. The next pro is that it doesn't care about any negative map modifiers. So this includes any that are on your temple from Xantipi's medallions, but also any kind of T15, T16 map that has 6 to 8 mods depending on your corruption. It doesn't care about any negative map modifiers. So these also include ones like reduced cooldown recovery, reduced life and mana recovery, any curses, basically anything that can that was usually really bad for blood mages. It doesn't care about any of them. It also doesn't care how scaled they are with your Atlas passes, and it would just blaze through them all without issue. Next pro is that it has really cool synergy. So as mentioned before, it utilizes both power and frenzy charges along with all 3 elemental infusions. And the last pro is that it is a 1 to 2 button build, depending on if you count holding down Spellslinger as a button. That also benefits from casting Spark every now and then. So if you like Spark, then this is up your alley as well. And with that, the main cons of this build is that it is insanely expensive to min-max. So I calculated some napkin math. If I were to sell my gear, basically everything on this build as is at the end of league, I could probably get anywhere between 30 to 40 mirrors. With the most expensive thing being the Time Lost Adorned and the Overworld Temporalis. So with that, even with the inflation that the 0.4 Temple brought to this league, that's still insanely expensive to try and get to this level of min-max. The next con is that it has green vomit galore. Every single aspect of this build has really bad visual clarity, so you won't really be able to see what the enemy is doing, what's on the ground, what you're doing. You just won't really be able to see much. And with that, it goes into the next con, which is that the triggers in this build lack you pretty hard. With how frequently they're proccing, which will lead to frequent instance crashes if you don't have that strong of a PC or graphics card. And for example, I don't, so every temple I crash at least once. The next con is that it cannot beat 6-man scaled pinnacle bosses that quickly. Bosses like Zesht. This build was really scaled to build or to fight temple or play temple, and so it wasn't really geared towards pinnacle farming. The next con is that it can't really easily beat Uber Arbiter. I know he was the big bad of this league, and one of the mechanics of his completely shuts down blood mages, so this build falls in that category as well. And the last con, which I think should be talked about more, is that it's not that controller friendly due to needing to spam blink and dodge roll in order to utilize the spam blinking or moving around, which causes issues with sprint on controller because it's very easy to go into a sprinting animation from a blink or a dodge roll on controller, and they haven't introduced a way to separate the hotkey for that in 0.4. And the bigger issue with controllers is that if you're holding down a button, it will count, or holding down a skill, it will count every single instance of trying to cast that spell as an input, meaning that it's very easy to, when combined with other things like blink, casting spark, or anything else, to hit the threshold to be kicked from the game for causing too many actions. This is not an issue on mouse and keyboard, because like if you're holding down a button like W for going up in WASD, it's not treated every single hold down input as an action. So that's the final and most important con in my opinion. But with that, I think this was a very fun league, and looking forward to what GGG brings in 0.5. I know that a lot of aspects in this build are going to be nerfed. For example, like the Doger's Undoing being counted as a hazard. I know that's definitely going to get nerfed because that was not what their intention for it to be able to generate energy. But also stuff like the bug with Solus Epsis, be able to equip multiple lineage support gems and be able to use them even though they're grayed out to some extent, like with Diala's Desire and the Uhtred's Augury and Omen. But yeah, I guess I'll see you guys next league. Thanks for watching.